Good afternoon. Hello, everybody. My name is Ramaya Krishnan. I'm Dean of the Heinz College and Director of the Block Center for Technology and Society. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to this really important Block Center event co-hosted with CMU's Scott Institute for Energy Innovation. Today's conversation comes on the heels of a panel event hosted by the Heinz College in November on the implementation of the Biden administration's energy policy. Today, we continue the important discussion about policy choices we face in our long-term transition to a decarbonization economy, focusing on the transportation sector. Decarbonization and our transition to renewable energy is one of the biggest challenges we face in our lifetimes. And it's not only an important policy challenge, it's a societal challenge, a global challenge, an existential challenge. Today, you'll hear from Block Center affiliated faculty member Javed Mohammadi about his exciting center-supported research, as well as from faculty from the Scott Institute here at CMU. We're pleased to be joined by Kamila Domanaski, from NPR, who will moderate a lively discussion later in the program. I'd like to also express my great appreciation to the Scott Institute for Energy Innovation for your support in assembling this panel, and gratitude for the shared awareness around these policy issues that transcend the walls of our respective centers. With that, I'd like to welcome my good friend and colleague, Anna Sifkin, to get us started.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Krishnan, and welcome everyone. We're so glad to see so many of you here with us today. A special thank you to the Block Center for the opportunity to partner on this well-timed and critically important event. So in addition to Krishnan, I'd like to send a special appreciation to both Mara Leff and Katie Ches for their insights and expertise in planning this panel. So thank you very much. So when we look back at 2022, decarbonization will most likely be considered the most critical topic of our time. And the Scott Institute for Energy Innovation at CMU, which serves as the hub for more than 170 energy and climate tech researchers across our campuses, has been delving into the most important aspects towards a lower carbon future for decades and longer. So be it energy storage and batteries, hydrogen, direct air capture, or building performance, we see a collective of researchers across the continents coming together to address the world's most pressing energy challenges. And we are glad to bring together today an exceptionally talented group of thought leaders to talk about EVs, electrification, and transportation. So first, we're going to have a short presentation from Javed Mohammadi, who I'll introduce momentarily, and then we'll have a panel discussion with Q&A. So a reminder that throughout this presentation, you can ask questions at any time by entering them into the Q&A section, that area on Zoom. So first, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker. So Javed Mohammadi is Assistant Professor in the Department of Civil, Architectural, and Environmental Engineering at our partner university, the University of Texas at Austin. So prior to joining UT, he was a faculty member with the Electrical and Computer Engineering Department at CMU. He is an IEEE senior member and a recipient of the Innovation Fellowship from the Swartz Center for Entrepreneurship at CMU. His research areas include multi-agent optimization and machine learning in networked cyber physical systems, including smart grid interactive buildings, power grid, and electrified transportation systems. So he is an alum of the Carnegie Mellon University, where he received his PhD in electrical and computer engineering. So Javed, welcome, and we look forward to hearing your presentation.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dean Krishnan. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Mara. Thank you, everyone. I'm glad to be here today. My name is Javed Mohammadi. I'm an assistant professor with UT Austin and also an affiliated faculty member with the Block Center for Technology and Society of Carnegie Mellon. And I'm very excited to talk about how transportation electrification will plug into our national decarbonization and resiliency discussions. And I would like to also appreciate the support of Block Center for Technology and Society for this research. Okay, so transportation electrification is one of the largest contributors to the global greenhouse gas emission. And for that reason, it's on top of many countries' agenda for decarbonization. And in the US, climate change concerns and governmental policies is putting transportation electrification in the spotlight. And Biden administration is aiming to achieve the sales of over 50% of electric vehicles by 2030, and also significantly reducing the greenhouse gas emission. And to support these goals, there is money earmarked in the infrastructure bill. We have money for EV charging networks. We have money for investment in energy grids and also in the infrastructure resiliency as well. So it's really important to see how EVs will plug into these equations of resiliency and decarbonization of our energy system. And while decarbonization could be still a hot button issue in some discussions, resiliency is not really negotiable. In 2021 alone, we had more than $27 billion weather disasters. And these weather events from wildfires to winter storms, they put our energy supply chain under pressure. They can disrupt the operation and also can impact the other technologies that depend on this grid, like transportation, like electrified transportation system. So it's really important to look into both of these, like both resilience and decarbonization, and how EVs will play a role in both of these fronts. So looking at the decarbonization, so there's a clear gain when you replace an internal combustion engine vehicle with electrified vehicle. But also it's important to remember that you need to provide electricity for these EVs. So the question is, where is the energy coming from? And that's really depending on where you are charging your electric vehicle, in which states you're getting your energy from different sources. So we looked at like the EV sales data and the energy generation mix across different states in the US, and how driving patterns are different from state to state. And if you put all of that together, we get to figure one, where you can see the emission cost of charging electric vehicle per day. So that obviously varies from state to state. So and there is a disparity from coastal areas to heartland. And in 2020, I think we have about 20% of our electricity coming from renewable energy sources. And if we don't really invest in the grid, the expectation, the IEA's expectation is that by 2030, we'll get close to 37% renewable energy generation. And so we will have a cleaner grid, but we will still have a disparity between these areas as shown in figure 2. So really the question is like, how would you increase the gain? How would you maximize the gain that you can get from electrification? And that really depends on your grid, right? So in figure 3, we looked at a hypothetical scenario where we were, when we were aiming to reduce the emission cost, reduce the emission of the grid by 50% comparing what EIA is projecting for 2030, and also aiming to reduce these disparities between these regions. And that will reduce the gap between different regions, and it will also decarbonize the grid. But it's really important to be mindful of like how we are picking, how we are deciding on the investment scenarios, and how we are deciding where we are reinforcing the grid. If you go to the next slide. Also thinking about decarbonization and distributing the societal benefits. Obviously, when as you are reducing the greenhouse gas emission, that would impact the global emission at the national scale and the global scale. But if you want to also make sure that all these different regions are gaining from decarbonization, efforts, that has to be front and center of these investments. And that again depends on like how you are providing electricity for these electric vehicles across different states. So in the study that we did, we looked at specifically how we can maximize reduce the gaps between different states. And we showed that by prioritizing some of these states with the highest emission, you can achieve the decarbonization goals, also distribute the societal benefits better between different states. And as we talk about different states, how we are decarbonizing the electric grids of different states, it's also important to look at how we are, what is the state of the grid in those situations. A figure on the left shows the expected investments in EV charging infrastructure that's already approved in the infrastructure bill. And a figure on the left shows the reliability ranking based on EIA's 2020 grid reliability data. Now, so you can see that some of these states that are standing to receive a good portion of these investments, they're not necessarily ranked the highest when it comes to reliability. So that opens up the question of like if you're adding these electric vehicles to the network, how can you be mindful of the grid resiliency and reliability? And when you think about grid resiliency in its broad notion, like any other supply chain, when something goes wrong, when there is a disruption, you usually have two phases. There's an absorb phase when you are trying to manage the situation, and there is a recovering phase. And electric vehicles, they could be used in both situations. You can expect the charging of your electric vehicle when you are trying to absorb the situation, or you can delay it depending on the needs. And those benefits can be really accessed by both heartland and coastal areas that are prone to different situations and weather events. But also the thing to remember here is that each of these electric vehicles, as we are thinking about them as a resource to provide resiliency, each of them are only providing nuggets of resiliency or flexibility. So the capacity that they provide for us is really small. Okay? So if we want to make this a considerable asset and make them help the grid, that's where really these aggregation and coordination methods come to place. And the question is like, how would you connect these electric vehicles, the flexibility of those to provide the resiliency for the grid if needed. So what we are trying to do here, we are trying to both gain decarbonization, to maximize the decarbonization, also trying to put electric vehicles as part of the grid resilience equations. And so that's where this is where really the managed charging is very important for achieving both of the goals. And to put that in perspective, we can think of electric grid as a highway that we built over 100 years ago. And this is a one-way highway for electrons to get from the source to the very end. And when we built that highway, we didn't really need any traffic lights. And now we have a lot of renewable energy sources being added. We have a lot of batteries and electric vehicles being added. So that's impacting the way that we are running this system. So that means in some situations, even the electrons are going upstream. And that's, I think, the reason that we have this famous case of California dog curve. So the managed charging is really important for us here. And you can think of these energy storage devices like stationary batteries and also electric vehicles as a parking lot in this story, that each of them are providing a small parking capacity, but you would get a lot of benefit if you coordinate these parking lots at a scale. So that's where you are adding a lot of capacities. So again, coordination can be helpful for decarbonization, it could also have a really meaningful impact for managing the grid better and providing these resiliency benefits. So what we're trying to do here is trying to connect these small kilowatts, small clean kilowatts to make them sizable and maybe making a megawatt of energy flexibility. Also thinking about how electric vehicles will provide other benefits, they also go well with the local sourcing. Some of the states in the heartland, they stand to benefit a lot from local sourcing, and local sourcing that means that you are using the energy that you are producing at the location, for example, from solar panels, and that would help a lot. That would help this the decarbonization a lot. It will also help a lot the resiliency of the grid. So I think we have like really good examples from other countries, like for example Portugal, that they are heavily promoting self-consumption as a way to provide resiliency and also provide decarbonization. And when thinking about resiliency, I think one thing that we need to be mindful of is as we are adding a charging infrastructure to the grid, the cost of grid reinforcement should not be burden some of our vulnerable end users, right? So it has to be, we have to be mindful of like how we are investing in the grid at the same time. So that's the reason that is, it makes a lot of sense to pair up the transportation electrification investments with the grid modernization efforts. And in some cases, we need to revisit some of the business models that we have for helping EV owners to be part of the a bigger energy game. They can get rewarded for the flexibility and resiliency. And so all of that needs to be revisited. But again, like we need to be mindful of like how we are distributing the societal benefits that we get from resiliency and who's paying for that. So it's important to take a note of that as we are thinking about grid resilience, as we are thinking about investing in our grid. And I think we have money already earmarked for different states when it comes to EV charging infrastructure, but the infrastructure resiliency and the energy funding is somewhat undecided yet. So it's very important to bundle all of them, those two together. And when you think about modernizing the grid, there are really two ways of looking at this. Like you can do a top-down approach when you start from gigawatts and megawatts of clean power. So you're trying to reduce the improve the decarbonization there. You can also start from the bottom up, and you can start with these clean kilowatts like solar panels, batteries, and electric vehicles, and try to decarbonize from the bottom. And these two come with different time scales, right? So top-down approach usually takes years because you have to get permission for new transmission lines if needed, and it takes a lot of investment. Some of these bottom-up approaches can be implemented relatively faster at a shorter time, and obviously at a shorter time scale. So, but really the key here is how are you integrating these electric vehicles with the rest of the operation of the grid, and coordination would be really the key. And the way that coordination is done right now is really often done in silos, in different geographical silos. So that has to be rethinked, and we need to revisit some of the procedures that we have there. I don't think we have like a unified strategy when it comes to aggregation at different utilities. So that's, we need to, there's obviously a lot of room for improvement in that front. And in the interest of time, I think I would end this conversation with a couple of takeaways. I think energy sourcing would be really the key here, both for maximizing the decarbonization benefit and resiliency that we get from the electric vehicles. Each of these ICE vehicles that we replace with an electric vehicle, we will obviously going to get a gain because we are not consuming, we are going to consume less gasoline, but we are like, let's aim to maximize the benefits that we can get out of them as we are making these investments. And for that to happen, all of the roads really lead to investment in the electric grid and how we are decarbonizing that system. And we need to be careful with, we need to strategize whether we are doing top down or bottom up. And each one of them comes with different time scales, and they offer different incentives. But I think one thing that will be beneficial here is the shorter time scale for doing the bottom up decarbonization. And with that, I would wrap up my presentation.
Javon, thank you so much for those comments. It's interesting to see this perspective, and I appreciate your time on this. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce our panelists. So each of the panelists, I think if you would, let's take the slide down and we'll have each of our panelists turn on your cameras so we can see you all at once. I'm going to start with Jeremy Mahalik, who is a professor of mechanical engineering and engineering and public policy at Carnegie Mellon University. He's the founding director of the Design Decisions Laboratory, founding co-director of the Vehicle Electrification Group, and an active member of the Green Design Institute and the Center for Climate and Energy Decision-Making. So Mahalik's research focuses on vehicle electrification, techno-economic and environmental systems assessment, green design, and energy and environmental policy, systems optimization, and design for market systems. Welcome, Jeremy. Next, we have Paulina Jaramillo, who is involved in multiple multidisciplinary research projects to better understand the social, economic, and environmental implications of energy consumption and the public policy tools that can be used to support sustainable energy development and consumption. So she's a Scott Institute Energy Fellow, and she's the co-director for both the Open Energy Outlook Initiative and the Green Design Institute, which are both housed within the Scott Institute. She is pursuing global research about infrastructure systems for development in the global South. So welcome, Polly. Next, we have Erica Myers, who is an electric vehicle subject matter expert with WRI Ross Center for Sustainable Cities. She leads the electric mobility team's research effort and works with cities across the globe to identify opportunities to electrify transportation, including infrastructure deployment and vehicle grid integration methods for public transit and other municipal fleets. So Erica has worked for nearly 2 decades in clean energy, alternative transportation fuels, distributed energy resource topics in government, for-profit, and nonprofit roles. Her background gives her a unique perspective on the opportunity to leverage renewable energy and electric vehicle charging to reduce emissions through widespread deployment of vehicle grid integration. In fact, she owns 2 battery electric vehicles powered by 100% renewable energy, which she manages through a networked level 2 residential charger. She currently serves on the EV steering committee for the U.S. Department of Energy and holds a leadership position in the Women of Electric Vehicles in Washington, D.C. So welcome, Erica. Last but not least, we have our moderator for today. She got a brief introduction earlier today, but I'm going to give you a few more details about Kamila Damunaski. She covers cars, energy, and the future of mobility for NPR's Business Desk. She got her start at NPR with the Arts Desk, where she edited poetry reviews, wrote and produced stories about books and culture, edited 4 different series of book recommendation essays, and helped to conceive and create NPR's first ever book concierge. So with NPR's digital team, she edited, produced, and wrote news and feature coverage on everything from war in Gaza to the world's coldest city. She also curated NPR's homepage, ran NPR's social media accounts, and coordinated coverage between the web and the radio. For NPR's Code Switch team, she's written on language, poetry, and race. And for NPR's two-way blog and news desk, she covered breaking news on all topics. So quite a range. She's written for the web about international approaches to climate change and was a regular host of NPR's Daily Update on Facebook Live, News Time, and co-created NPR's live headline contest head-to-head with Colin Dwyer. So welcome, all of you. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm looking forward to an exciting dialogue. So with that, Kamila, I think you are going to start with some questions. And again, a reminder, please use the Q&A as an opportunity to send questions over, and I can help moderate those as we're going if we have a lot of them that come through. So thank you all.
Awesome. Thank you for that much too lengthy introduction. But I also want to note Javad from the Block Center has joined us for the panel discussion as well. So thank you so much for that presentation, which definitely gave us a lot to chew over as a group. And in fact, I'll start by noting that when we had a little meeting to prepare for this session, several of us noted we could spend hours and hours talking about any one of the topics that come up when you talk about how to balance policy priorities and decarbonize transportation. But I want to start by asking each of the panelists to just focus on one potential thing that could go wrong, right? If we assume that the transition happens, that we have decarbonized transportation at the end of a road, that doesn't mean that the path to get there wasn't rocky. So what is the potential pitfall that keeps you up at night the most? And I'm going to say, Erica, why don't we start with you?
Thanks, Camilla. The thing that keeps me up at night is that the benefits of this transition do not outweigh the cost, be it environmental impacts from mining these new materials, the social impacts, for example, labor transitions not happening successfully for our automotive sector or for the fossil sector, grid constraints and the cost to upgrade the grid to handle this. And then overall, the goal of reducing the carbon emissions, which is, I think, something universally that we're aligned on, is transportation decarbonization, and that EVs are kind of the best option, at least in the near term, for transitioning away from depending heavily on fossils. So that for me is something that we've never really done successfully. It's approaching a big transition like this from a systems thinking approach, and it will require almost every actor to work together to make it happen. So yeah, it's a big worry.
Awesome. Paulina, how about you?
So I think the question is a little weird for me, because what keeps me up at night is that electrification of transportation isn't happening fast enough and isn't happening everywhere. So that's really what keeps me up at night, more than things that may happen after to make it successful or not. So I don't know if that's the right answer, but what keeps me up at night is that this isn't happening fast enough and everywhere.
The length of the road rather than the potential pitfalls on the way, maybe might be one way.
Yeah.
Jeremy, how about you?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest underappreciated challenges has to do with the rollout of public charging infrastructure. It's very, very different than gasoline stations, because on the good side is that electric vehicle range is getting longer. Most households have some off-street parking. Nobody's got a gas station in their garage, but you can put a charging station and charge point in your garage and leave every day with a full tank of electricity. So that means on most days, most households aren't going to need any public infrastructure. So what the challenge is that they are going to need that public infrastructure on those peak days when they take long trips. And everybody takes long trips on the same days, Memorial Day, Thanksgiving. And so I can imagine highway public charging infrastructure being really underutilized until those peak days in which there's just huge queues to get your vehicle charged up, because you can't charge as fast as you can fill a gas tank. So when the infrastructure is needed, there'll be a longer queue that forms. Then the other part of that is that all those households that don't have off-street parking, renters, my previous house did not have off-street parking. And it's really hard to get households like that to transition unless there's such a robust public charging infrastructure that they can treat it more like a gas station. And so we're not there yet. I think that either we're going to need plentiful extreme fast charging in those kinds of neighborhoods so that people can treat them like gas stations, or some kind of partial automation where the vehicles can drive themselves to charge overnight. Otherwise, it's really hard to imagine a lot of those households adopting without reliably being able to fill up their vehicle whenever they want.
Yeah, so two different charging challenges, the road trip puzzle and what do you do if you don't have a driveway? Javad, how about you?
I think building on what other panelists mentioned, I think to provide the energy that's needed and to accommodate the needs of these drivers for a longer trip, We need to make sure that we have EV charging infrastructure that is reliable and resilient and has access to energy and hopefully clean energy. So how do we integrate those EV charging infrastructure with the rest of the system, and how we can provide clean energy for that, and how we make sure that we have equitable access for all of the society.
Now, so where does the energy come from? Which I know, based on the questions that we got submitted in advance, is something a lot of the attendees and are also asking about. So I wanted to pivot then, instead of asking about the doom and gloom and pitfalls, about potential models. And this is a conversation that's really focused on policy levers. So I wanted to ask all the panelists, what's an example from anywhere in the world of a piece of policy that you think could provide a model, whether national, regional, or local, for how lawmakers, how local governments or national governments can actually make this happen, can pull these levers here. Javad, why don't we start with you on this one?
Sure. So I think a good example is some of the European countries that are already ahead of the curve on this. Like, for example, Portugal is promoting a lot of self-consumption to make sure that you are doing clean sourcing and trying to maximize try to charge as much as your electric vehicle as you can from the local sources that are available. And that's something that I think we can take note of that for the US.
Jeremy, how about you?
Yeah, I think that we have to remember that the end goal is not electrification, it's decarbonization, and even decarbonization isn't the end goal. I mean, decarbonization is one thing that we're doing to try to improve the quality of life for people today and in the future, and so we have to balance that against other things that could improve or worsen quality of life. So I think with that all in mind, I mean, ideally, a carbon price is the thing that can help us balance all of those things. If everybody has to pay when they emit carbon, then that gives them the incentive to try not to emit carbon, and they would take actions that reduce carbon emissions where it's most cost effective to do so. Very hard to pass this. Some places have, but it's difficult to pass because when you tax carbon, you make a lot of enemies really fast, and that's hard to get through the political system. So the thing that's been dominant in changing what we've done in transportation in the United States, I would say by far the biggest thing is the light-duty fuel economy standards and greenhouse gas emission standards at the federal level. They effectively cap the amount of carbon dioxide that the entire vehicle fleet can emit. So no matter what else we do, it doesn't affect the total carbon dioxide that the fleet emits. That is decided at the federal level by the federal fleet standards. I'm saying it roughly, is more caveats than that, but I think that's certainly the most, the biggest policy that affects emissions from transportation. And then lastly, I'll mention that in terms of electrification, it's really the states in the US that have driven this. California in particular. Without California's policy, it's not at all clear to me that we would be even where we are now, despite Paulina, wanting us to be much further. I don't even think we would be where we are now without California mandating that automakers figure out a way to sell vehicles without tailpipe emissions.
Yeah, and the increasing number of states that we're seeing adopt California standards as well has been an interesting phenomenon. Awesome. Paulina, how about you? What's a policy role model?
Yeah, so there was an article by a colleague of yours in NPR last year that reported that 9 out of 10 vehicles sold in Norway last fall were electric vehicles. And the driver policy is that electric vehicles are exempt of the 25% value-added tax that vehicles are incur in Norway, and that electric vehicles, so 25%, like no tax basically on electric vehicles, is probably a very big incentive. The other thing is that the Norway already has also environmental pollution taxes on gasoline vehicles to account for CO2, but also NOx emissions, and electric vehicles are exempt from that tax. So effectively, they've made buying electric vehicles cheaper, and it seems to have been pretty successful.
Awesome. And Erica?
I wouldn't point to any particular policy as being ideal. I think we all collectively, globally need to work on finding resolution to a lot of the externalities that I mentioned in my prior comments. ICE bans, for example, internal combustion engine bans or mandates are great at accelerating deployment and providing really good policy signals to manufacturers that help make the commensurate investments in making these vehicles available, but we don't really have a good solution on how do we permanently take these ICE cars off the road. And our concern at WRI, the World Resources Institute, is that these cars will end up getting exported to places like the global south. And so then they become the problem of some other nation rather than those that are implementing the policies. So this is something that needs to be corrected in the policy itself that I have not seen done in a really good way yet.
Yeah, so you're seeing a focus on producing new vehicles, but the question of this massive existing fleet and where does it go is something you haven't seen resolved anywhere, basically?
No.
Yeah. I wanted to turn now, I'm going to throw this one out to you guys and make it a little more open-ended, whoever wants to take it. This is something that Javad touched on in his presentation, but I think we should dig into it a lot more explicitly, which is the fact that electric vehicles in particular, they're giant batteries on wheels, right? What are the opportunities that it presents for the grid of having this really unprecedented volume of energy storage deployed in a distributed way across the country? And what are the challenges that come along with that as well? Who wants to take a stab at that? All right, Jeremy.
Yeah, so it's right that electric vehicles provide an option for storing energy, and storage is really necessary for having high penetration of renewables. The wind is available when the wind blows, the solar power is available when the sun is out, and we use energy during times when neither of those things are happening, so we need a way to store. It's very different than fossil fuels. If you want more energy from a coal or natural gas plant, you just put more coal or natural gas into the boiler and you get more electricity out. And so this transition, the big challenge in this transition is making sure that there's storage available. So it's certainly possible that having a lot of electric vehicles with the capability to delay their charging or even sell electricity back to the grid could help that transition. But you also asked about the challenges. I think there are a number. Number one is there's not a ton of revenue to be made doing that. So there's not a big incentive for electric vehicle owners to participate in such a program. It could, degrade the battery a little faster to have more energy coming in and out of the battery. So there's sort of a disincentive. It also, I always say that I'd like to be available to go, run 2 states over if my sister goes into the hospital or something in the middle of the night. I don't want my vehicle, half uncharged. And so there's some value to me to keeping my vehicle charged. And I think that it's a little bit limited how much we can incentivize. And finally, the other big challenge is that if you give that flexibility to the grid to kind of buy when the electricity is cheap and sell it when it's expensive, the first thing a grid operator will use that for is to increase the utilization of their fossil plants, because those are the cheap ones, and those are the ones that aren't being fully utilized at night. And so if you charge your electric vehicle at night, first thing you're going to do is produce more energy from coal. So at least in the short term, there may not be an environmental benefit to doing that. Our hope is that in the long term, it can be part of the solution for how we transition to a more renewable dominated grid.
Any other thoughts on the promise or perils of using cars not just to use electricity, but possibly keep them back? Erica, take it away.
Yeah, so I would just like to mention, the role of the consumer with bidirectional charging. I don't think it's adequately discussed in a lot of these types of forums. So for example, a lot of people talk about electric school buses as being a great example of a fleet that could be utilized, highly utilized for bidirectional capabilities. There's about 4 terawatt hours worth of electric school bus potential in the United States that could take, a substantial amount of the intermittent load that we get from solar and wind. However, we don't have a really good way to translate that value to school districts at this point in time. The energy markets are incredibly complex. It increases huge amount of risks in terms of that initial investment for school districts that they may or may not be able to actually utilize. There's no EVSC standards and interoperability requirements, so it makes it difficult to aggregate these resources together. And then pricing, there's no pricing transparency usually from the utilities or the bulk power markets that would help support school districts in making these decisions. So, you know, the panacea would be ultimately that schools will actually make money on the use of these school buses that help to reduce other overhead costs, you know, increase pay for teachers and staff. I mean, I think these are all things we would like to see happen, but the actual way to implement it is still completely unclear. And so I think that goes back to like just the fundamentals of the energy markets needing to be more fair and transparent.
Javad, is this an example of your top-down versus bottom-up framing around how the top-down mechanisms are a little better understood by a lot of the players in this market?
I was muted, sorry. Exactly. So I think I look at like the bottom-up approach at two stages. One is like how to mine those flexible kilowatts or clean kilowatts, like how to incentivize the owners better, how to make sure that we are revisiting some of the business model around their engagement and making sure that if we are asking them to use their battery, they're getting paid for it fairly, and we are also not overusing each one of those. So this means that we will potentially have access to a limited capacity per each one of those. So the next question is like, how do we make those small capacities matter? And that's where you have to use them the right way for decarbonization or resiliency and using them at the right time. And the other thing that we have to be mindful too, there could be also some operational considerations along the way that as we're adding more, and this is true for electric vehicles, solar panels, and every other device that has inverter, as we're adding more of them to the system, how we need to make sure that we are not making the system more prone to cyber attacks. So we are effectively opening more doors to the system. So that's something that we have to be mindful as the number of these assets increase as well.
The cybersecurity element is something we got a question in our Q&A about. And so I'll just throw this out there. What can the grid operators do? What can policymakers do to protect against these cybersecurity vulnerabilities?
That's a $1 million question, right? So I think that's a great question. I think that's not only related to electric vehicles; it's related to any other type of device that's connected to the grid, whether it's your Nest thermostats, whether it's your smart fridge. Like there should be protocols in place that will protect the grid locally at the device level, also monitoring the operation of those assets at the grid level. So we need two types of protocols, both at the asset level and also at the grid level. But we need to really ramp up our efforts on that in general, because we are adding a lot of those assets to the grid, so that has to be taught along the way as well.
Anyone else want to tackle the cybersecurity piece of the puzzle? If not, I'll pivot to a huge question in these conversations, which is about equity. There are a lot of possible pathways for supporting a decarbonizing transportation sector that also involve subsidizing the wealthy or hitting low-income families with extra costs. So what is a possible policy prescription that you see for reducing that risk, or for creating a just transition, a way to actually alleviate equity concerns rather than add to them? And I'll throw that out to whoever wants to take that up. Paulina, take it away.
I think we have to keep in mind that electrification of transportation isn't just electrification of personal vehicles. And that decarbonization will also require electrification, expansion of public transport systems, and electrification of those systems. So I think we need policies to improve, in the United States specifically, to improve transit and the usability and the convenience of transit, as well as electrifying the transit fleets. I think that's also true in a lot of developing countries where transit infrastructure is non-existent, and demand for mobility is going to be increasing. So how do we think about improving access to those other options that are electrified? And there might be some interesting, in terms of the connection to the grid, the operating patterns of transit systems may pose different opportunities for grid integration. So I think it's just important to keep in mind that electrifying transportation isn't just electrifying personal vehicles.
Jeremy?
Yeah, I agree with Paulina, and then I wanted to add that when it comes to personal vehicles, we have to remember that at least the carbon benefits of electrification are shared among all of us. So no matter who adopts, the reduction in carbon emissions, they don't go to that owner, they go to everybody. And so there is a role for, I mean, we definitely want to be careful about taxpayer money going to wealthy people who don't need it or who would buy those vehicles anyway. I mean, that's a policy concern for sure. On the other hand, the idea that the wealthy will adopt electric vehicles first, in some ways they're helping drive down the cost of the technology so that it could become more accessible to everyone. And it's generally, for lower income neighborhoods, they're more in the used market. And actually those vehicles going through the first owner and into the used market gives us a little time to deal with that infrastructure problem that I mentioned, where the lower income vehicle owners are more likely to be renters, maybe less off-street parking, and so those vehicles are going to be coming into the used market, and gives us a little bit of time to solve the infrastructure problem for those households as well.
Erica, I'm curious what, yeah, go ahead. I was going to ask what you thought about this.
Yeah, I would just add to, like, we have to consider all aspects of the transition, including the impacts on energy costs for the broad base of consumers. When we think about incentivizing electric vehicle charging infrastructure models today with things like demand charge subsidization for those charging stations, those costs have to be borne by somebody. And usually those costs are added back into the rate base and then borne by all of the consumers that use energy. And so we don't want to have a situation where particular individuals are getting benefit of having the EV, but then other people are paying the cost of that transition that aren't necessarily taking advantage of it. And so those individuals, for example, that don't even own a car, or those individuals who will probably not purchase an electric vehicle for a variety of reasons. Maybe they don't have an option that works for them. Maybe it's a situation where they can't even really afford the bill they have, and they can't afford a bigger bill. So we need to be thoughtful about how we're deploying incentives and thinking about the impacts on the broader society. And I think that demand charges are just one example of a situation where we could have negative long-term impacts and perceptions about the role of EVs and this transition. We definitely don't want to have a situation where we have consumer backlash against EVs, especially in this early stage. And for me, that energy piece in particular is one that I get very concerned about.
I have to say I share the same concern as Erica does, about the cost of energy and the cost of grid reinforcements that needs to be done. Who's picking up the tab, basically? So given the ratepayer system, so is that going to be directed toward the customers that they don't even have electric vehicles, or how they're going to make a model that will that we are distributing those costs fairly?
Awesome. Well, I wanted to take some time now to turn to some audience questions because we've gotten quite a few. And I wanted to start by throwing this out there to whoever wants to take it. Beside electrification, where might hydrogen fuel cells fit into transportation decarbonization? Paulina, take it away.
I've done a lot of reading about hydrogen as part of the work for the IPCC. I think, this is my opinion, that while fuel cells might have niche applications in some locations for personal vehicles, the inefficiencies associated with the additional conversion just do not merit. Like EVs are just winning in that realm. I think hydrogen will likely be very important for long-haul transport, shipping, and aviation, which are part of the transportation. So I think hydrogen will definitely be part of the discussion. I just don't think it will be part of the discussion for personal vehicles.
Yeah, even Toyota and Honda, which had placed very big bets on fuel cells, are finally starting to pivot towards electric vehicles for passenger vehicles. But yeah, heavy trucks are a different story. Anyone else want to take the hydrogen question here? We move on to the next one from our audience. So another one that came in from the audience that I'm curious to hear y'all's perspectives on. A couple of different people actually asked this in a few different ways, which is what are and who are the obstacles to decarbonizing transportation in the US right now? And they asked, one way of asking this was comparing this to, in the past, automakers were kind of blockading a pivot toward electric vehicles. Doesn't appear to be the case anymore. Who might be doing it now? Or comparing the US to Europe, what accounts for the difference in the decarbonization strategies and the aggressiveness of the policies here? What's keeping the US from following more of a European pathway? So I'm going to throw that out there to whoever wants to take it.
I can comment. So one big difference is that Europe taxes petroleum much higher than the United States does. So you have much higher petroleum prices, which makes a difference on the relative cost of owning and operating an electric versus a gasoline vehicle. I think if you looked at externality prices, at least there's been economists who would say that basically the US underprices gasoline and Europe overprices it. And so anyway, you end up with this sort of, that's kind of one of many factors that affects the transition. Something that's on the other side is that in the US, we have a lot of space, a lot of garages, and so we have maybe less of that problem of having to rely on public charging infrastructure. There's an awful lot of households that will do just fine with a charger in their garage for almost all of their travel. Whereas in Europe, there are a lot of dense cities that, where people can't rely on the same parking spot every day. And so, so there's kind of a bigger challenge in Europe that they've nevertheless start to overcome. The other big factor is that in the US, trucks are extremely popular. If you include SUVs in that, it's the majority of light duty vehicles. And so until just this year, I mean, there were almost certainly no pickup trucks and very few SUVs available that were electrified. It's really it started out as a small car, or a car, I should say, passenger car phenomenon. And so Europe, is much more dominated by smaller vehicles, and so the availability just hasn't even been here until now. Now, as we get into more SUVs that are available in electrified powertrains and even pickup trucks and off-road vehicles, you get into a larger subset of the market that at least has the option to buy those vehicles.
Anyone else on players who are holding back decarbonization or forces that are preventing movement in that direction? Yes, Erica?
Well, I'd say that we could probably point to some actors that seem a little bit more obvious. There are individuals in the fossil industry that have been investing in, campaigns to increase things like EV road use taxes and things like that. So it becomes like disincentives for EV adoption. But I think probably the bigger culprit that we don't really talk about is the fundamental philosophy around land use and transportation planning in the United States. We've adopted a very different approach to transportation here compared to our counterparts in Europe or elsewhere, which is more investment, public investment in public transportation, In the US, we have very underinvested in public transportation, as well as developed a philosophy around building cities around highways and roads, as opposed to the alternative, which is building cities around people. And so we have this direct conflict inherently in our approach to transportation between decarbonization strategies that we know are safe and effective for people versus what we've been investing in for the last 100 years. So I think it will, in a lot of ways, be a fundamental shift in how we approach and design streets and transportation options.
I think one thing that also could help with customer adoption would be reducing the range anxiety, and that's something that's we are hoping that with this EV charging network that's going to be invested in, that could help with that. So that could be a big help for pushing customers to adopt more EVs.
I mean, I feel like we don't want to get into this too much, but I think we can't ignore that the political system in the US is preventing the deployment of all decarbonization technologies.
Yeah, let's take the last 4 minutes of our conversation here and talk about the American political system and its dysfunctions. No, I do think we might have time for just one more question to squeeze in. And I wanted to ask, someone said this discussion focused a lot on consumer behavior. What's the role of industries in a pursuit of decarbonizing transportation? Anyone want to tackle that one briefly?
Well, I guess industry, we need automakers to manufacture electric vehicles and to manufacture more. Like we can't have just one model of electric vehicles. People have so we need a broad range of options to choose from because consumers are very heterogeneous in what they're looking for in vehicles. And then the power sector has to work on all of these will require an expansion of generating capacity, low carbon generating capacity. So accelerating that, but also just like investing in the grid to be able to manage the integration of electric vehicles. I actually think this is much more systemic than just consumers. Like it will not just be individual consumers who drive the electrification of the transportation sector.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, I mean, in our system, corporations need to make decisions that are going to be profitable for, to return value to their shareholders. And so when they invest in these future technologies, they need to be doing so because they can see a future in which they need to be taking leadership in order to maintain that. And so I think when some of the policies from California and the federal government initially started, there were a subset of automakers that really treated them as just pure compliance. Like, okay, I'll do the minimum that I have to do to comply with this. And there were others that said, because I sort of have to comply with this, let me pivot my strategy and try to run with it and maybe get ahead. So I think the policy has made a huge difference on whether it's in firms' best interest to invest and innovate and try to be out ahead on this technology. And I really think that that's shifted a lot in the last decade. I mean, I think that automakers sort of pretty much agree gasoline's going away. And so, you don't want to be the last one to try to figure out the technology. You want to have the patents. And so that innovation is a big role that the industry can play in sort of making these vehicles more affordable for everybody and more competitive across the market.
Rod, we've got about a minute left. You want the last word?
Sure. I think one thing that we also need to be mindful of, going beyond transportation electrification and looking at the energy system shift, who are we leaving behind? Like what would happen to some of these jobs that are being lost? Are we retraining them? And that would have a big implications for people, for easing people's mind to adopt new solutions and being open to decarbonization. I think jobs, like how we are gaining that, I think, and losing some of the jobs, I think that has to be a really big part of this conversation.
Thank you so much to all the panelists and to the audience for your questions. And I'll hand it back over to you.
Great, thank you so much for insightful dialogue. We certainly appreciate you, Camila, for being a part of this conversation. Thank you to Jeremy, Paulina, Erica, and Javad as well for being available to us this afternoon with your thoughts and insights. We really appreciate it. And thank you again to the Block Center for partnering with us, for allowing us to be a part of this opportunity. We appreciate all of you. It was a big crowd that we had today online. We certainly appreciate seeing you dialing in from all over the world. And we had so many questions, we could not get to all of them. So thank you again for your questions. I think they're incredibly helpful in terms of helping us to sort of shape and think about the future. So with that, I think we are done for today. We are at the end of our time, and I just want to say thank you again, and we will sign off. So thanks everyone for being a part of our event. Good to see you.